Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovetz. MTV Studios has a wonderful new film out by writer-director Jared Frieder called 3 Months, about a young Florida man awaiting the final results of an HIV test. We're joined today by Denis Nash, Executive Director of the CUNY Institute for Implementation Science in Population Health, to talk about advances in AIDS protocols and the possibilities of a cure. Denis, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
There's a whole lot of waiting happening in the movie 3 Months, and the most painful, protracted delay facing our hero Caleb is a 90-day wait before he finds out if he's been infected with HIV. But the movie is set more than 10 years ago. In 2022, for somebody recently exposed, does it still take that great amount of time to get a full, clear vision of whether or not they've been infected?
Well, testing technology and what we call next generation HIV tests have come a long way since 2011, but there still is what we call a window period. It can be up to like anywhere between 15 to 30 days now. Of course, the waiting period is much shorter if the person turns out to be infected, but it takes longer to determine that someone is negative.
In 3 months, Caleb is not having a great first summer after high school. Along with the potential for HIV, he's also got a case of gonorrhea, which takes just a couple of days to diagnose. Are the different time frames based on our knowledge and understanding of gonorrhea, or is gonorrhea just a different beast?
Gonorrhea is definitely a different beast. It's a bacterial sexually transmitted infection, and when people have urethral gonorrhea, they will develop symptoms within 2 to 5 days after they're exposed, and they can get a test that will tell them if they're positive right at that point.
Why are bacterial infections easier to diagnose and cure?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're necessarily easier to diagnose and cure. I think that there are every pathogen is different. And viral infections, some viral infections are harder to treat than others. Some are easy to treat. I'm thinking about hepatitis C, for example. It's curable very soon after treatment begins now with advanced treatments. And some bacterial infections are very difficult to treat. And here I'm thinking about especially the ones that are drug resistant, that become drug resistant to repeated use of antibiotics, incorrect use of antibiotics. So I wouldn't say that bacterial infections are necessarily easier to cure and treat. It really all depends on the pathogen. It depends on whether or not there's a drug that is capable of killing the pathogen in the body, and whether or not the drug can reach all of those places in the body where the pathogen may exist. Otherwise, we're left with a chronic infection or a situation where someone's going to have to rely on their own body and immune system to clear the pathogen.
A lot of the science details in this movie are about the passage of time. Caleb arrives at the clinic more than 3 days after being exposed to the virus, which excludes him from a life-saving early intervention called post-exposure prophylaxis. A lot of questions there. What is it? How is it administered?
By definition, you take a drug after the exposure, post-exposure, and prophylaxis means prevent. And so this is a class of drugs, the same class that's used to treat HIV infection if you have it, can be used post-exposure to prevent the establishment of HIV infection when an exposure has occurred. And so if you take this drug within 72 hours, and ideally within hours after the exposure, it can be very effective.
Why does it have to happen so quickly?
If HIV infection is going to happen, it happens pretty quickly, within 72 hours. And so after that period, the drug won't be effective at preventing the establishment of HIV infection anymore.
That's actually an amazing piece of medical technology.
Yeah.
You know, we see a lot of billboards of PEP and PrEP. So what's the difference between PEP and PrEP other than the extra R?
So while PEP is meant for post-exposure, PrEP is meant for pre-exposure. So this is a preventive drug that you can take before you have an exposure. It's sort of anticipating the likelihood that you may be exposed either through sexual contact or through needle sharing. If you take this drug regularly, daily, or sometimes on demand, prior to an exposure to HIV, it can prevent as well the establishment. So it's a lot more proactive, and it's a way that people, an important way that people prevent HIV today.
Does the short time frame of exposure, is that related to any virus, or is it particular to HIV?
Every pathogen is different. It may take longer for some viruses to take hold than others. If you look at rabies, for example, if you have a bite from an infected animal, you can take rabies post-exposure prophylaxis, rabies PEP, 10 to 28 days after, and it will still work.
In the movie 3 Months, our hero Caleb is smart and talented and vital, and he doesn't know about any of the very important things we're discussing today. He's ashamed and alone, and he delays getting himself to a clinic, which voids the possibility of life-saving treatment. Denis, does hate and shame and all the things that go along with hate and shame make public health harder?
It does. And there's very real and intense feelings of hate and shame and stigma and discrimination around HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, around sexual and gender minority populations where society has marginalized them in many ways. I think that it gets in the way of so many things that public health is trying to do. It gets in the way of so many things that individuals are trying to do to thrive as human beings and live, happy lives in society. And I think it can't be overstated how big of an issue that this has been from the very beginning in public health's effort and society's efforts to really deal with the HIV pandemic.
How are we doing in New York?
I think New York is on the forefront in the U.S. for on the vanguard, really, of how to manage the pandemic. We have some of the most forward-looking health officials and healthcare providers. And I think that as public health moves towards this large-scale effort that we call ending the HIV epidemic, New York was one of the states that began this effort first anywhere in the world, actually, where we really decided that the tools exist for us as a society to drive down HIV infections, to drive down HIV-related deaths through prevention and treatment to levels that no longer threaten public health anymore. So I think New York is doing very well. But with any HIV epidemic, there are always those groups that are the hardest to support and reach. And it's because society has marginalized people living with HIV and people at risk for HIV to such a large extent that it is difficult to really end the pandemic for everyone, which is what we need to do, at least end it as a public health threat for everyone. But we have many people living with HIV and at risk for HIV who have many of these barriers, like homelessness and substance use and mental health disorders, poverty, and all kinds of other competing issues that get in the way of people putting themselves and their health first.
The movie takes place in Florida. Any thoughts on the legislation coming out of that state and how it affects public health?
I can't think of a more toxic legislative and political environment right now than Florida in terms of its policies as it relates to almost everything. But just looking at health, COVID has been abysmal. Just look at the anti-LGBTQ policies that are coming forward. These are hateful policies. These are hateful. Weaponizing government against marginalized populations and disadvantaged populations. It's not good for society. It's not good for public health.
It's a Sin is a BBC TV series about a group of young gay men confronting HIV for the first time. But that series takes place in a 10-year period starting in 1981. And spoiler alert, or not, every character in that series who gets AIDS dies. 30 movie years later, in 3 months, Caleb's best friend Dara is upset for him, but still very upbeat about Caleb's future. Even if he does test positive, Dara tells Caleb, people live with this shit forever. Do they? In 2022, is HIV a death sentence?
No, not at all. And I agree with Dara, and if there very much. And if there's one thing the message that I would have loved for Caleb to get early and continually throughout that whole ordeal, which is no matter what the outcome of his test, he's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. He will, if he tests negative, then he can continue to take steps to stay negative. And if he tests positive, there are very effective life-saving treatments that people live healthy lives with normal life expectancy And so that was, I agree with that statement. And I think that it's an important message for everyone who has an HIV exposure or who worries that they may have HIV while they're waiting to find out. It's going to be okay.
Can you speak to the change in the message from public health from the early AIDS epidemic to what's happening now?
Yes, as you alluded to, the early days of the HIV epidemic everywhere, before treatments became available, were very scary times and very upsetting, devastating times. And with that came a lot of fear, and sometimes stigma emerged from this as well. But the fear of HIV, which many people still live with today because they lived through it. That fear made its way into the public health messaging and how we talk to the public at large about HIV. And even after treatments became available, even after it became clear how to avoid HIV, how to prevent HIV, the fear messages stayed with us for a while, and the fear messages even turned into shaming messages in some instances, and this perpetuated the stigma. And I feel that this is one area where public health kind of failed, and we could have done a better job at updating our messages to go along with some of the optimism that came with the new technologies, the new treatments that are available to really help people with HIV and to prevent people from getting it today. I hate that today, in this day and age, where we have so many tools available, that people can be afraid to have sex or afraid to get into a relationship or worried about getting HIV, instead of focusing on being in the moment with the people they love and care about. That is something that happens, and it is a vestigial of some of the fear-associated public health messaging that came with the early days of the pandemic, but didn't really evolve.
In the early days of the pandemic, most of the diagnoses came at very late stages, so that the disease seemed so incredibly cruel because it was being diagnosed at the very end. It was being diagnosed just before death.
Yes, it would appear, before we really understood a lot about the natural history of HIV and AIDS, that it was rapidly fatal because people would die soon after they were diagnosed. But in fact, what we know is that it takes about 10 years for people who are infected with HIV to begin to develop the symptoms of AIDS on average. So, but we didn't know that, and it took a lot of science and a lot of epidemiology and research to characterize the virus. We didn't even know it was a virus at first. We didn't have a test for it. All we had was the ability to examine someone who had symptoms of AIDS and say, yes, this looks like AIDS. It's a syndrome, before we knew it was a virus.
In the BBC series It's a Sin, when a character is first diagnosed, everybody is terrified of every bodily fluid the infected man, let's say, ejects. But in 3 months, set in 2011, Dr. Diaz has a husband who is HIV positive, and for them there's hugging, there's kissing, there's everything. What changed to allow this joy to come back into people's lives that you speak of?
Yes, well, we've learned through epidemiology that the ways in which HIV is transmitted and the ways in which it is not transmitted. And we learned pretty quickly that this is not something that's transmitted through hugs and kisses and ordinary social contact. But even though we learned that pretty early on, it took a long time to convince people that was true. And so people's behavior, as we're seeing today with the COVID pandemic, are not necessarily in line with the up-to-date science on the issue. So it can take a while for people to get to a place where they don't have the fear. And there was a lot of fear around HIV in the early days.
And back to the world of Yay Science, the creation of PEP and PrEP must have opened up whole kinds of worlds of intimacy for people.
Yes, I think this is a really important example of the transition that has been happening. When PrEP became available, some of the initial stigma and moralizing and shaming came along with it. There were use of the words Truvada whore, which is an example of how people would stigmatize people for using PrEP instead of ordinary prevention methods that we had been promoting, like condoms and HIV testing. So there was stigma around the idea of PrEP. And then after that, we got past that, there was still a lot of discussion about how people should only use PrEP if they're at very high risk for HIV, which is true. It's good for people who are at very high risk for HIV, but...
should I only wear my glasses if I'm really, really farsighted?
Right. And the other thing is that, if PrEP is something that people can take not only to prevent HIV, but to help them feel safer and better about, having relationships with people they love and care about, then that's a great thing too. And we should be promoting it for those purposes as well. So I think that the PrEP kind of is at the nexus of where we were and where we need to be in terms of how we talk about this pandemic.
It seems like it just seems like a strange thing to think that there's a shame in taking a medicine. Why? Because it's sex? Is it? Oh,
I think it has a lot to do with the stigma that's around that goes around sexually transmitted infection, that goes around being a sexual and gender minority in this world, in this country and many other countries where it's highly stigmatized and frowned upon by many people in mainstream society, and so it's a confluence of all of these things.
I think that all of those confluences, all of those things are really bad for the general whole. It's not, they don't just attack the minority populations. They're bad for all of us as a whole, especially when applied to public health.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. And, not everyone with HIV falls into one of these marginalized groups, right? Many people with HIV are not sexual and gender minority. Or they're not an injecting drug user, and yet I would argue that some of these folks still experience some of the stigma because of the nature of HIV and because of what people believe, often incorrectly, about the virus.
But we're hearing so much lately about individuals being cured of AIDS. Is that an anecdotal thing applicable to only that individual, or are there movements towards a cure?
And it's definitely in the news a lot lately. There was one within the last year, I'm pretty sure, that we heard about and made a splash in the news. These situations are important, but they're also very rare circumstances. For example, they involve the last one involved someone who had leukemia and HIV, and they underwent a very harrowing treatment for leukemia, which is a bone marrow transplant, and received cells from someone else, stem cell transplant from someone else, after they went through that ordeal and survived their treatment for the malignancy. They also were found to be free of HIV, and this kind of reinforces the notion that it's possible to cure HIV, but the way that they went about it in these three instances is not something that is scalable or feasible to do for the 38 million people around the world that live with HIV today.
So do you think that if there was a universal cure, that cure would be so dreadful to go through in the ways that chemotherapy is so dreadful to go through, that it's almost worse than the actuality of living with HIV?
Yeah, so if it is worse than taking daily medications for HIV every day, and by the way, these medications are getting more, they're becoming more tolerable. We're moving into an era where we can inject people with medications that last for 1 or 2 months, and they don't even need to worry about daily medications. So the cure would have to be something that is as acceptable or more than something like that. If it turned out to be something, very, very difficult, a long ordeal that carried with it a high risk of death, like a bone marrow transplant, most people with HIV would not.
Denis, were you seeing parallels between the HIV pandemic and the COVID pandemic?
Yes, very early on, this was something that came to my mind, as well as a lot of my colleagues who work in the field of HIV. there was delays and slowness on the part of elected officials to sort of reluctance to acknowledge the fact that we may be headed into a crisis situation that demands resources, that demands a response, and demands acknowledgement on the part of elected leaders. That played out very much in the case of HIV as well as COVID. The sort of missteps in deploying resources for public health, like testing and messaging and things like that, couldn't follow without it. And I guess the other big parallel that I see is the potential for inept politicians to really take control and influence the trajectory of not only the government response, but the entire pandemic, when it really should be something that's driven by subject matter experts and scientists. This happened both early on with HIV and throughout into the 80s and 90s, and it certainly is something that has happened on steroids with COVID-19. So I think there are, unfortunately, a lot of lessons that we didn't learn from earlier pandemics when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. I really hope that going forward, we can take so many of the lessons that we've learned during COVID-19, hard lessons, and some that have not even been acknowledged by many people, but apply them to future pandemics.
It's a whole world of storytelling. It's a whole world of storytelling and misinformation and goals that are not actually public health. People with goals people whose underlying goals are not public health, dealing with public health.
Yes, I mean the storytelling is an example. You have to, people are going to believe the most believable person and message that they hear, and sometimes that's the first message by someone that's familiar to them. And if that message is the wrong one and it gets out there and takes foothold, then our job as public health people becomes much harder. We not only do we need to convince them that what they currently believe is wrong, we have to then do the job that we normally would do, that just convince them to do what we think is important. So it's doubly hard.
Your work sits at the crossroads of a lot of things that all the rest of us are worried about. Are you hopeful?
Well, as an epidemiologist, I am very excited about how our field has become more visible during the pandemic. I'm excited about how many of us have mobilized to collaborate and take on new challenges so quickly and have learned so much, not just epidemiologists, but scientists in general. The amount of knowledge that has been generated and advanced and leveraged to do good public health during this pandemic is unprecedented, the speed at which it happened. And so in that sense, I'm very hopeful that science can continue this kind of progress and will be in a much better place when future pandemics occur, and they will occur. I'm very worried about the field of public health and in general, because I feel that another thing that we've witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic is the marginalization of subject matter experts and scientists by politicians and elected officials, and how politicized science has become. And we've seen how the messaging that science puts out there, or the knowledge that science puts out there that is intended to be translated into messages and information that people can use and that governments can use to protect entire populations, that has become distorted and even overtaken by a huge machine of misinformation and disinformation that public health is just not equipped at the moment to compete with. And so this is a real challenge for us. We have to figure out how to not just produce the science, but to leverage it into behaviors and actions by governments and individuals that are going to be the right ones. right? To get people to believe in it, and when people begin to distort it and use it in the wrong ways to mislead, that it can be credibly and roundly squashed. But we do not have the tools at the moment to do that.
Public health, I would assume, doesn't really attract that sort of power player, that sort of aggressive person who wants to shove their idea down the throat of a nation, the way politics does.
Yeah, and I would say scientists, myself included, don't necessarily think of themselves as the messengers to the general public, don't necessarily think about themselves as the bridge between their work and having it translated into, the real world and what it means to the real world. I think we have to be better at it. But I think that we need allies who are good at communications. We need allies who are good at leveraging social media and YouTube and other platforms to get the right messages, the accurate messages from a scientific standpoint to the right people at the right time.
Well, every disaster movie starts with a scientist being ignored.
Right.
And we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much, Denis, for spending time with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.